Hello, bonjour, nakaribu sana. My name is James Milner. I have the real privilege of being the project director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. Along with the Refugee-led Research Hub and the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford, with the support of a number of wonderful partners, including the Open Society Foundations, the Bosch Foundation, Canada's International Development Research Center, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We've been delighted to be able to support research on refugee-led organizations in East Africa. Today, we have the great joy of launching this report, and we'll be walked through the report by the four lead researchers from Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. But I'm very keen to get out of the way because the star of the show today is the report as presented to us by the four lead researchers. The report and the executive summary is now live. It's out in the world. So the link to the website for the Refugee-led Research Hub will appear in the chat box, and that is where you are able to access both the full report and the executive summary. If you require closed captioning, please use that option on your toolbar. And I'll just ask Richard if you could put the link, please, where viewers can see the full report and the executive summary. If you could put that in the chat box, I'd be very grateful. But let me now say a word of introduction of our researchers and allow them to be able to share the report with you. This is a journey that has been many, many months in the making, and it has been such a joy to work with Nhira, with Abbas, with Mary, and with Uwezo. I'd also like to say a special mention to Pauline Vidal, who is the research manager at the Refugee-led Research Hub, who's played an invaluable role in helping to facilitate and help guide some of this research. But the core work, the data from setting the research questions to gathering the data, through the mapping, through the data analysis, through the presentation of results, all of these steps have been led by our four country researchers, our country lead researchers. And Nhira Kara is the lead researcher for the study in Kenya. She's originally from Sudan and currently lives in Kenya as a refugee. This experience has emboldened her to stand up for the rights of displaced people, including as a member of the Youth Advisory Committee for the Displaced and Refugee Youth Enabling Environmental Mechanisms project. Prior to joining this research team, Nhira worked as a communications assistant at the Children's Committee of the African Union in Addis Ababa, and she holds an MSc in International Development from the University of Edinburgh. Abbas Getachew is the lead researcher for the study in Ethiopia. He was previously displaced in South Africa and has since returned to Ethiopia. Prior to joining the team, Abbas has been involved in several research projects on displacement in collaboration with the German Development Institute and the Refugee Studies Center. He holds a Master's of Commerce in Economics from the University of South Africa. And Mary Gitahi is the lead researcher for the study in Uganda. Mary is a refugee from Kenya, currently living in Nakiveli settlement. Prior to joining the team, she led the Kuja Community Feedback Program for 3 years with Alight Uganda, where she supported the exchange of feedback between implementing partners and refugee communities. Mary has a dream of raising awareness on refugee competence and the impact of localization in refugee communities. She holds a BA in Business Administration from Makerere University in Uganda. And we're also joined by Uwezo Ramazani. Uwezo is the lead researcher for the study in Tanzania. He's a former refugee from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and currently resides in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Prior to joining the team, Uwezo worked with the Resilience Action International, an RLO operating mainly in the Kakuma refugee camp, most recently as Director of Programs. Uwezo holds an MA in Governance and Leadership from the Open University of Tanzania, as well as an MA in Public Administration from Mzembe University in Tanzania. Karibu sana to all of the lead researchers. Na asante sana for the tremendous work that you've done in guiding this research through the process. I'm going to pass the floor now to the researchers, starting with Nhira, who's going to take us through an introduction and the conceptualization of the concept of refugee-led organizations in East Africa. Nhira, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, James, and welcome everyone. Well, the emergence, the RLO refugee-led organization study and their response and impact on displaced community in East Africa has been as a result of the emerging evidence that RLOs or refugee-led organization in East Africa play a vital role in meeting community needs. And up to now, there's lack of vigorous evidence on the impact of these RLOs on displaced communities. So this study looked at how these refugee-led organizations are perceived by the communities in which they operate, and what factors condition their variation in response and the impact of this refugee-led organization. The study is led by a team of researchers that were affected by displaced or are refugees. Some of them are still refugees from the start to finish. And like James mentioned, it's funded by a consortium of donors that were mentioned earlier. The study has been done in 4 countries in East Africa, that is Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And among these countries, each of the country, 3 places or 3 refugee camp or settlements, including urban areas, were considered in regards to the data collection. We had 2 phases, and during our first phase, which we called it mapping phase, the team reviewed firstly literature sources and mapped around 178 RLOs. And we also conducted rapid phone interviews with actors that involved refugees and also other stakeholders to just have a good grasp of the diversity of the RLOs and the landscape within each state. The team then selected from the diverse a sample of around 60 RLOs to be able to examine them in-depthly. And the findings are based on 60 key informant interviews with RLO leaders and other 60 key informant interviews with stakeholders, external stakeholders. We also had around 120 focus group discussions with RLO beneficiaries and community members, and also focus group discussions with RLO managers, staff, and volunteers. And in our definition of refugee-led organization, it is adapted to the diversity of forms that they take in most of the countries in East Africa. So RLOs for us included any organizations or association, coalition, it can be formal or informal networks, faith-based groups and initiatives led by refugees or asylum seekers in either urban or camp or settlements. So they may be registered, and some of them are unregistered groups, and their main function is to respond to the humanitarian and developmental or cultural needs of their communities, of their refugee-related communities, and also host communities. So some of them, they support their own membership, like self-help groups. Others are, special interest groups or ethnic groups or other refugees that, or other RLOs that include host community. And in terms of the exclusion, we were able to exclude the organizations that were for-profit or had for-profit elements, and also those ones that might not include refugees at their board of management or refugees as the key decision makers or the founders. And the study established we conceptualized that RLOs are divided into 3 main stages of development, and that is directly linked to their funding capacity as well. So we have the first stage, which we conceptualized as self-help phase. This is where they exist informal groups that aim at providing services to their community members who are not, most of these organizations or groups within this stage are not registered. And RLOs in this stage are mostly dependent on membership contribution, which can be made upon registration or maybe contribution boxes that they might be having, or they might have a monthly contribution or annual contribution. Some of the organization in this stage as well may engage in some income generating activities, some small income generating activities where profits are taken back to the work that they do. And we found out that most of the women-led groups or organizations are found at this stage. The other stage is the growth phase, where these RLOs now have, most of the RLOs at this stage have been registered and are able to provide services to both their community members and they're members that have registered, but also the community members. And sometimes here, some of these organizations tend to have to provide services that typically are along their ethnical lines. They're able to engage also at this stage with diaspora and have variety of activities, and also some of them are able to have greater networks and even have humanitarian organization as their donors. And RLOs at this stage also look for other humanitarian and other individual donors that are within the country, but also abroad. And then we have the last stage that we conceptualize as the expansion phase, where it is targeted to larger RLOs or community-based organization. And at this stage, the RLOs are fully registered, and some of them have even registered as NGOs and have wider networks, and they're able to access a wider range of funding from both humanitarian, but also within diaspora. So I think at this stage, I'll be able to let my colleague, Abis, to be able to explain to us about the perceived impact of this RLOs. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andira. Regarding the perceptions of beneficiaries, there is in general a positive attitude towards the RLOs. The reason for these positive perceptions of the beneficiaries towards RLOs is that they are treated with respect and dignity compared to the support they are getting from other aid organizations. So as RLOs are located very close to the community they serve, the services provided by RLOs are perceived to be more fair, and RLOs are able to identify who needs more support amongst the community members. Similarly, for beneficiaries to get services from RLOs are less bureaucratic and are easily accessible to the community members, given that they have less administrative costs and they are more accountable for the community. The fact that RLOs are close to the community, both physically and emotionally, no one is perceived to be marginalized from getting such services. So, for example, members of the refugee community who needed most of the help, let's say, for example, during the first few days and weeks of arriving to the host country without proper refugee paper or asylum seeker paper, can also benefit from the RLOs without being marginalized or being asked for their formal paper, formal either refugee paper or asylum seeker paper. And now, again, the proximity of RLOs again allows RLOs to be the first to respond for the emergency issues within the community. For example, an emergency issues amongst the community members. For example, during off working hours, say during the night or during the weekends, where UN and other aid organizations are not working, it is these RLOs that come to rescue the members of the communities in a well adapted and culturally accepted manner. So RLOs are also known for their support giving for the excluded members of the community or marginalized members of the community where their activities are assumed to be illegal in the hosting country. Um, Now, in addition to these humanitarian support the RLOs are providing, these RLOs are also known for their provision of certain form of livelihood support for their members as well. For example, some RLOs provide microloans and ongoing support to their community members so that individuals in the community can pull out themselves out of poverty. In discussing now the impact created by RLOs, it is very important to understand about the networks, the importance of networks of RLOs. RLO success is largely determined by the networks they are creating with the humanitarian organizations in the diaspora community. For example, in countries like Ethiopia and Tanzania, the where the RLOs are not allowed to register, they are more dependent on diaspora networks rather than humanitarian organizations. So, and the other way around, in Kenya and Uganda, where there is more permissive environment compared to that of Ethiopia and Tanzania, more RLOs rely on the networks with the humanitarian organizations. Now, these networks are again dependent on the personal and professional relations of the leaders with the diaspora community and with the humanitarian organizations. Now, mostly urban-based, educated, English-speaking RLO leaders that are especially men are more likely to get access, while women led RLOs are more likely to be in self-help stage of the RLOs development that Andira have mentioned earlier. So this is mainly due to the structural barriers and the structural barriers that women have in these communities. Now, I will leave the floor to my colleague Uwezo to discuss about the regulatory framework of the RLOs and the partnership challenge of the RLOs. Uwezo, over to you.
Thank you, Abis. The regulatory framework has a significant influence on RLOs' ability to access resources and partnerships and to implement their activities safely and openly. The impact of the regulatory framework affects RLOs differently in each of the 4 countries. Whereas in Uganda and Kenya, RLOs can operate openly even if they are not registered, while hindering access to funding. Unregistered RLOs in Ethiopia and Tanzania are unable to operate safely and experience difficulty in opening bank accounts to receive funds. And despite significant progress and support from a range of stakeholders, registration in all 4 countries remains a challenge for RLOs that are led by refugees with low literacy levels or limited education, who lack networks with area chiefs and refugee supporting institutions, and who might not have funds to move from the camp or settlement to the relevant office. Restrictions to freedom of movement in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania also impede RLO leaders' ability to develop their organizations. In terms of partnerships, RLOs do also create partnerships among themselves and with other stakeholders. These partnerships bring exposure to RLOs and legitimize them to the donor community, and in some cases, to the refugee community. Many international non-governmental organizations engage RLOs to enhance access to communities. In Uganda and Kenya, for example, RLOs implement projects on behalf of NGOs on a short-term basis the parameters of which are often predefined by aid organizations. In those instances, RLOs act as intermediaries between the community and the aid organizations. In Ethiopia and Tanzania, partnerships largely consist of small-scale in-kind contributions. There is also the issue of providing capacity building to RLOs, which is common in Kenya and Uganda and is emerging in Tanzania and Ethiopia. In terms of accessing partnerships, registered RLOs with online presence and those with professionally connected leaders are more likely to access partnerships. In Tanzania and Ethiopia, however, the restrictive environment doesn't grant RLOs power to contribute to discussions on localization or setting priorities for the refugee response. Therefore, meaningful engagement remains sparse, while some aid organizations play an active role in transferring funding opportunities for RLOs. For example, what we are seeing in Kenya with COIA, which has created a platform named Reframe that displays the work of RLOs and advertises funding and project opportunities. The funding models in the humanitarian sector and the larger NGOs and the UNHCR are slow to change. RLOs are often involved in projects already set up by international non-governmental organizations as a way to promote localization, but there is no associated transfer of power or resources that they could use as a co-funding for sustainability. Thank you. Let me pass the floor to Mary.
Recommendations from the RLO studies. Before I start on the recommendations, stakeholders should pay special attention to the inclusion and exclusion criteria of RLOs and ensure that there is meaningful non-tokenistic engagement. So the independence of RLOs should be maintained so that they can continue to contribute to the aid sectors. To the donors, philanthropic and state donors are recommended to prioritize co-funding and long-term projects in order to create space for all RLOs to achieve their objectives. They are also encouraged to fund unregistered self-help groups that are led by marginalized refugees in order to ensure equity of engagement with RLOs. As Anthera mentioned earlier, most of the female-led RLOs are stuck at the initial self-help stage. So in case there is a need to support such a category of RLOs, then the donors should ensure that they really support this group of RLOs. Then adapt funding requirements to the specific needs of RLOs. The specific needs of RLOs should be prioritized when making decisions about funding by jointly setting performance indicators. Then consider setting up refugee-led monitoring groups to keep RLOs accountable, which the groups should include monitoring members and leaders. So the donors should also advocate for policy change at government level, since they have a better chance and are better positioned to influence such changes. And then involve RLOs in meetings and fund associated access costs that include but not limited to translations to government and authorities. In Kenya and Uganda, where the contexts are a bit similar, governments are encouraged to allow a more easy, simple, systematic registration process for the RLOs. This is in order to accommodate the different types of RLOs that have different types of leaders that may include marginalized groups and also some illiterate leaders. In Ethiopia and Tanzania, policies that allow RLOs to register should be set up in line with the realities of the present RLOs. Then when it comes to land allocation in camps and settlement, the process should be made clear and the criteria to which activities qualify for allocation of the RLOs should be communicated to the RLOs despite their size or nature. Then to the UNHCR, communication with RLOs should be improved, and this can be done through developing a database of registered and unregistered RLOs. There should also be dissemination of information about RLOs in ways that are adapted to the needs, and also I consider dedicating a staff position to RLO engagement by a refugee experienced in community engagement. Then implement and adapt global UNHCR policies towards RLOs at the field level. The UNHCR has great and beautiful policies at the global level. However, it's not often, or it's not always, that these policies are reflected at the national and at the field level. Then advocate for policy change at the government level. So UNHCR should ensure that they advocate for policy change at the advocate level. Then next, to the aid organizations, involve RLOs in decision-making through equal partner consortia. Aid organizations should engage RLOs as project co-owners from the outset, ensuring that RLOs contribute to the project, especially in the critical decision-making stages. That also goes a long way in boosting their confidence. Then capacity building should be paired with funding in order to actualize the impact in the community, and this will also ensure that the learned skills are not forgotten in the long term. RLOs, aid organizations should be long-term allies to RLOs by managing the expectations they have on what RLOs can achieve, and also be the #1 champions for the ideas that are generated by refugees and RLOs, give credit and recognition to RLOs, and also create more space for RLOs in the humanitarian industry. And then support the operationalization of a remote one-stop service center through setting up a group of mentors that can support RLOs in adhering or conforming to the ideal standards of operation, and ensuring that these committed group of refugees are able to deliver to their communities in accordance to their objectives. And then finally, I would want to say this to the RLOs: set up RLO to RLO partnerships on projects. This is especially important to RLOs that already have access to networks, RLOs that are already well established. It's going to go a long way to unlock the challenges that the smaller RLOs, which are still in the initial stages, that are led by marginalized refugees, to unlock the challenges of accessing networks and resources. And in the long term, there will be the appreciation of joint efforts of RLOs in truly contributing to the welfare of their communities. Then ensure that networks are inclusive. So the importance of inclusive networks is that this will enable RLOs that are not able, again, to access resources, networks, donors, funders, be able to do so in a way, in a simpler manner, and also not lose their independence. And then finally, take steps to ensure community accountability. This study showed that community acceptance ability of communities to identify with the work that RLOs do is very important in motivating and keeping an eye on the projects. So the moment RLOs are able to set up community accountability committees or groups, then this will ensure that there is longevity to their to the substantial work that they are already doing. And then in addition to the RLO study findings, this study has gone a long way to showcase that researchers from displaced backgrounds are also capable of delivering and leading rigorous studies, especially in matters that concern their welfare. So there is a joint call from us and all other stakeholders support researchers from displaced backgrounds. I would not end this presentation without passing my regards to each and every person who contributed to this study, starting with the mentioned donors, the Refugee-led Research Hub, and then there is LERRN, the Refugee Study Center, and most importantly, the RLOs and the participant communities. Back to you, James.
Thank you very much, Mary and Uwezo, to you, Abbas, and Adhira as well. It was a really rich presentation, and as you will have seen, the full report and the executive summary are all available online. We've already received 5 or 6 questions in the Q&A box, and I'm going to curate those a bit in a moment. But I do want to underscore, Mary, the last points that you made about the importance of positionality. And I have learned so much from Mary and Uwezo, Abbas, and Adhira, not only in what they found in their research, but the way that they approached the research. And so while the report is a really important tool in advancing our understanding of refugee-led organizations in East Africa and elsewhere, it's also a very important reminder of the substantive value of foregrounding all stages of the research cycle in the perspective of those with lived experience of displacement. And here I would note that the East Africa study is one of 2 regional studies that are currently taking place. And in the second half of November, we will be circulating details of a launch for the Middle East study, which is being undertaken in parallel to this East Africa study. So thank you for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you for such a wonderful report, which is available online. And now I'm going to turn to the questions and comments that we have received online, and I'll do my best to perhaps direct some of these to the lead researchers individually, but some to all of you collectively. The first question that we had was in relation to whether more can be said about the structural barriers that are faced by women-led initiatives, especially at the self-help stage. And so, Mary, in a moment, I think I might pose that question to you, Mary, because I think it's something that became quite acute in the Uganda case early in the research. So, Mary, in a moment, if I could ask you or others to jump in on the structural barriers faced by women-led initiatives at the self-help stage. Bahati Kanyamanza asked the question about RLO to RLO partnerships. And the question is, and I think very much within the context of the role of power and power relations, but what are the challenges that hinder RLO to RLO partnerships? Is it communication? Is it questions of power? Is it contacts? And is there a role for an RLO network to strengthen this sharing and these partnerships in the East Africa context? And I'd invite any of the researchers that want to speak to that. Let me just highlight some of the others. Is the regulatory barriers that are faced, and Matai Muan speaks to this as something that's very clear within the recommendations within the study. The question says that in the study, it seems as though Kenya is more open than Ethiopia and Tanzania. And Hira, I think a question to you in terms of what is it about Kenya's more favorable regulatory practices that we should highlight? What is it in Kenya that is of particular note? Is that a recent phenomenon, and how can that be encouraged elsewhere? And then there's also a question here about grassroots community engagement. And the question is overlap between RLOs, and is part of the question of RLO partnership a question of avoiding overlap? And then maybe I'll just add one more question, and this is on the question of balancing partnership and independence. All of you in the four countries found that the presence of RLOs was conditioned by the regulatory environment, but also conditioned by their relationships with UNHCR, with other NGOs. There's a question of how these relationships can be improved, and in the report there was a focus on building closer relations, but a question in the Q&A box raises the question of what independence should RLOs seek to maintain so that they remain independent from UNHCR, from large international organizations. I'm going to stop the questioning there and turn it back to you. Mary, a specific question to you on barriers faced by women-led organizations, and here a specific question to you on the regulatory environment in Kenya. And Uwezo and Abbas, I'd be keen to hear from you on this question of RLOs retaining their independence, and also on how the relationships between RLOs might be improved. So let me pass it back to all of you, as we have just such a wonderfully rich selection of questions in the Q&A box. So top marks to our audience. Mary, can I start with you, please, on the question of barriers for women-led initiatives? And then Hira, I'll come to you. Mary, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, James. So this is quite an interesting question, and it takes me back to our data collection process, whereby in the initial stages, actually during the mapping out phase, we were not able to, it was not easy to identify any female-led RLOs, especially in Uganda, and this was because due to the fact that sometimes even the female-led RLOs themselves were not able to self-recognize as an organization or group of people that are having an impact in the community. So the structural barriers range from the already existing cultural barriers, lack of access to funding, and maybe some illiteracy, lack of education, some illiteracy, and the mere fact that sometimes the environment that these RLOs operate in are not very, very conducive, and they are somehow wired to feel like they are not able to achieve anything. And yet there are so many beautiful and celebrated stories by this group of women. There are so many hardly ever heard of impactful activities by them. So, and I think there is some work being done by aid partners and authorities to see that the women-led refugee organizations are also coming to power with their male counterparts, but it's not as much. So there is also lack of enough institutional support to these female-led RLOs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. And Hira, can I come to you next, please?
Yes, absolutely. I think in Kenya, in regards to the regulatory framework and how And how easy that is, there's no clear or clarity on how RLOs need to register in terms of in law. But however, in our findings, we found out that RLOs, for instance, in different settings, like for instance, in the urban areas, are able to register as CBOs, that's community-based organization, through chiefs on their areas. And in the camp setting in Kakuma and Kalobie, to be specific, they were able to register as CBOs, some of them involving host community, in order to find registration or to get certain registration. But it all was more dependent on the network, and also the relationship between the RLOs and also the host or the DRS, the Department for Refugee Affairs right now. And one thing that is also very progressive in Kenya is that we have a new refugee bill, and that we hope is going to ease some of these challenges that RLOs are experiencing in being able to find clarity in regards to registration. But we also have partner or other aid organizations that are quite working on helping these RLOs to be able to register through the DRS, and mostly at the camp settings in Kakuma and Kolobie. I think Norwegian Refugee Council is active on the ground to be able to provide that capacity, and also just advices on how to register their CBOs through the government of Kenya. Yes.
Thank you very much, Indira. Very, very helpful. Uwezo, can I come to you now on these questions of overlap and independence? Tanzania is a very particular environment in which you were working. I'm wondering what thoughts you had, not only from the context of Tanzania on the notion of relationships and power and RLOs needing to retain independence, what we learned from the case of Tanzania and how that compares to what you've found in the collaboration across the region. Uwezo, let me pose that question to you first in the context of Tanzania, and then Abbas to you in the context of Ethiopia. Uwezo, please.
Thank you, James, for that question that has been raised by participant. In terms of overlapping of activities, for instance, let me start by Tanzania. For instance, in Nyarugusu refugee camp, most of RLOs are engaged in English training language, because this is one of the activity that the government doesn't interfere with in the camp setting. Any group can start these activities and the government will not interfere. But if you start any other activity, you may be questioned, are you registered or not? But since English is felt as a need and the government doesn't much about it, most of those RLOs which are emerging tend to start such activities. In Kenya, there may be overlapping activities because of where does fund go. If they think that most of funding are being pulled in education, so most of RLOs will start activities related to education in order to get funding, because it's where the money is being channeled. That is one of the reasons of those overlapping of activities as we in the 4 countries. In terms of independence, it is true that RLOs, since they are still emerging, they don't have the same power as international non-government organizations. So there is still power imbalance. International organizations have financial capacities, while these RLOs are still small. Most of them, depending on their members' contribution, they can't compete in the search of funding. So if they are required to implement any activities by an international organization, they will probably be ready to do that in order to help their communities. That is why it will be difficult for them to compete with international non-government organizations or even high NGOs like UNHCR, but there is a need to have that balance of power or independence. They should implement their activities on their own, as they know much better how to best implement those activities instead of being given a plan by an international organization because only they have a fund or they have already gotten fund to implement that activity. Then they impose the way in which that activity should be implemented in the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uwezo. Abbas, let's come to you for your thoughts on that, please.
Thank you very much, James. This is a very important question. Now, how to keep the independence of the RLOs is a good question. And now, when we bring it to an Ethiopian context, it is really a luxurious question. This question, like first, like Ethiopia has a progressive law, a very progressive law in 2019 that allows refugee-led organizations to get registered and refugees to group themselves and get registered without any problem. However, this law has a problem when it comes to the ground, because when it comes to the ground, there is a civic society organizations bill that allows organizations to register in two ways, either to be a local organization or to be an international organization. So these refugee-led organizations are neither of the two. So for the local organizations, it needs an ID of the person who will be in charge, whereas the international organizations need passport, in which the refugee community doesn't have either of them. So this is one of the basic problems that we are having. And now these networks that, like the networks that the RLOs in Ethiopia, that the elite groups of RLOs in Ethiopia are largely dependent on the networks through the diaspora community. In the diaspora community have been refugees themselves, and they know the struggle and the hardship of the community. So since there is more like a shared experience between the refugee community that who have community who have resettled in Europe and in the North America. So it is possible for this community to like, there is no independence that the RLOs are keeping, because it's a shared experience and it's more of it's more of a support that has been shared before resettlement of the diaspora community. The most important thing here is network with humanitarian organizations. That is almost impossible, because also humanitarian organizations and UN organizations want to work with registered organizations. So in order to get registered, there is this obstacle. So keeping independence with the humanitarian organizations is, I think, is a level higher in the case of Ethiopia, unlike other countries, especially in Uganda and Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abbas. Really helpful reflections on that. I do want to say I've hosted, I can't think of how many webinars I've helped moderate during the pandemic. And to everyone in the audience, I want to say you all get top marks for participation. These are some of the best questions that I've seen in just about any webinar that I've helped moderate. So really top marks to all of you for your questions. And I think that really speaks to the interest in this topic and to the the provocative nature of the presentation and the quality of research that we've heard. So we have quite a number of questions still in the chat box. Some of these I think we'll follow up with by email, but I'm going to group them into three kinds of questions. And to the researchers, I'll turn to each of you to be able to answer these questions and to use this as an opportunity to offer your concluding comments as we move to end the webinar. There's a first set of questions about risks that is encountered by RLOs, whether that's from the pandemic, COVID, whether that's security concerns, whether that's a consequence of power inequalities between RLOs and other actors. Were there examples of where RLOs faced particular risks? And can you give us a sense of how RLOs manage that risk and how support can be further encouraged? There are quite a few questions. So that's question one, managing risk. Question number two is how these recommendations can be implemented. Quite a few questions in terms of, how do we ensure more support is directed towards RLOs? A question from Benjamin Ngaru that said that despite all of the commitments of localizations, Grand Bargain, Charter of Change, etc., that the amount of funding to national NGOs, let alone RLOs, has in fact dropped since 2018. So given all of the calls to action, I'd like to hear from all of you as researchers, what can be done? What needs to happen for these recommendations to be implemented? Are there particular actions or priority actions that you think can be undertaken? And then the last question I'd like you to reflect on is where do we go next? And it leads to the question of what needs to happen, but where do you think we need to go next in terms of research, in terms of advocacy, in terms of policy? Is it supporting RLO to RLO networks? Is it about making sure that the results of this study, for example, are really showcased at a global level to inform global policy discussions on RLOs? So 3 questions for you, and use these as a way of moving through a conclusion. Number 1, what risks do RLOs face and how do they mitigate those? Number 2, how do we actually implement the recommendations? How do we overcome these barriers that need to be addressed? And then number 3, where do you think we need to go next? So those are my 3 questions to help move us to conclusion. And because you've done such a great job with managing time, there's 2 minutes for each of you. Where shall we start? Shall we go in reverse order? And Abbas, I'll start with you, and then Uwezo, and then Hira and Mary. I'll give the final word to you. So we'll do it in reverse order from the first round of questions. So Abbas, can I put you on the spot and pass the floor to you, please? Abbas, go ahead.
Thank you, James. And again, thank you for the very nice questions. Now, when we talk about the risk, RLOs, I think RLOs in Ethiopia are facing higher risk than any other countries in the region. This is mainly because of the registration issue, mainly. And the second issue is mostly very active RLOs are Eritrean RLOs, in which they are also sharing culture and language of the northern part of Ethiopia, Tigrinya, and since they are speaking the Tigrinya, then they are mostly harassed and abused by the police forces, assuming that it's very hard to differentiate between the Tigrayan and the Eritreans. So due to these reasons, they are facing high risk. And how do they solve the risk? They are using again networks and again bribing the police, and by paying an extra amount of money for the policemen to go out of jail. So that's normally how they do it. But what should be done in order to solve this problem? Really, Ethiopia has a very progressive law of 2019. But again, the problem of registration, specifically out of all the articles, the article that mentions about organizing or being organized in groups without any interference or without any involvement of the members of the host community is there. However, this is completely in clash with the bill of the CSO. So what we have to do in the case of Ethiopia is to reconcile these two bills, and if we have to amend the CSO, I think that's what the governments have to do, and that's what the government should be pushed to do. Um, so next, where are we going on this? Again, there is a lot of work regarding this, specifically as Mary has mentioned earlier in the presentation. Um, there is a homework to do from aid organizations, UN agencies, governments, and also from researchers and activists from us, that we have to push the government and other stakeholders. And in addition to this, there is also an assignment for the RLOs to use the available platform to exclusive to use the maximum potential of the space that is allowed especially by the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abbas. Uwezo, let's pass the floor to you, please. Uwezo, go ahead.
Thank you, James. In terms of risks, for instance, in Tanzania, operating without registration is one of the risks that RLOs are facing, but also in the urban center, for instance, in Dar es Salaam, some RLOs are being run with the refugees who are not registered by the government, so they are undocumented. So implementing activities while the government doesn't recognize you, it is also a challenge. And in terms of registration, again, to avoid repercussions that can arise, some of the refugees trust locals to register organization on their behalf. This has a risk in terms of funding. For instance, when they get funds, sometimes these nationals who run or manage the bank account may use unfairly the fund instead of implementing the activities for which they have been funded. Those are some of the risks RLOs are experiencing in Tanzania. In terms of the next step, as we mentioned, this research has now shown or has brought evidence from the anecdotal that we had. So there is still need to further the study by doing further studies, for instance, in terms of coming up with a research to explore or examine the real impact of the work of RLOs, because what we have mentioned in this research is just perceived impact, but also it is a call now to the global community to trust RLOs, because this research has shown publicly that there are great work that RLOs are doing in their respective areas of operations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uwezo. And Hira, to you, please.
Yes, I wouldn't repeat. I think a lot of my contributions were said by my colleagues, but I think something that I can add in regards to where do we go next? I think we have plans to do a lot of dissemination on this report, but just not on the regional report, but individually country reports that we have that is able to explain even better country specific contexts in each country. So we have upcoming reports, country reports that will be able to disseminate, but we also are hoping to do this with the community and also have them engage in this and bring more actors in regards to advocacy and other actors that are able to sit down and actualize some of these recommendations that we have and share as widely as possible the work that we've done. Yes.
Thank you very much, and here I'll say another word about that in just a moment. But Mary, the final word to you, penultimate word to you, please. Mary, go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I think my colleagues have said much of what I would have wanted to say. But just in addition, to ensure that the study is transformational, I think we intend to leverage on the existing resources of networks to ensure that the findings of these studies are presented to decision-making platforms, whereby we hope that there will be an influence in the existing policies. Additionally, I think there should also be a capitalization on the non-traditional actors in the refugee setups. For example, the private sector. In Uganda, there was an instance whereby there are two financial institutions that are trying to work with refugees and refugee-led organizations. So such actions should be welcomed and guided to ensure that they fit within the humanitarian industry, so that refugee-led organizations can benefit to the maximum. And to what Anthira has said, I think the dissemination is intended to ensure that the participants and also non-participant refugee-led organizations and communities are part of, enjoy part of the findings of the study, and also be able to use them to continuously improve calls for accountability from the community and service delivery by refugee-led organizations. Back to you, James.
Thank you so much, Mary and Hira, Uwezo, and Abbas. The primary goal of this research was to move from anecdote to evidence. And clearly, we now have very strong evidence on the scope and scale of the work of RLOs and the work that needs to be done to ensure that the impact of RLOs in East Africa can not only be recognized, but amplified. To everyone in the audience, please read the report and share the report. As Anhira noted, in due course, there will be the country-specific reports will be published, and further activities will be planned to share those reports not only at a country level, but to return the research results to the communities where the research was conducted, with the tremendous help of the research assistants who worked on this study. So, as I said, this is the beginning of just the next stage in a journey. We will be circulating details of the Middle East report when that is launched in the second half of November. But I encourage everyone to please read the report, share the report, and use the report as a tool to continue your individual and collective advocacy efforts on behalf of refugee-led organizations. My sincere thanks to Mary, to Anhira, to Uwezo and Abbas for tremendous work on the project, on the report, but an exceptional job in presenting the results so succinctly. My thanks to colleagues at the Refugee-Led Research Hub, the Refugee Studies Center. Particular note of thanks to Pauline Vidal for her tremendous work in supporting this research right the way through. My thanks to the team at LERRN for supporting this webinar, and my thanks to everyone for joining us for this webinar. We'll be posting a report and a recording of this webinar on the LERRN website and on the RLRH website in due course, so keep an eye open for that. But for now, thank you for joining us. Asante sana. Stay well and take care wherever you may be. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.